agus stracelt saoirse na hÉireann ach umranóna am the boga go Palestine agus is beag an difríocht in our era mar tá dína encouragedach saoirse dína eile agus na dína ha faoi unsaí I géirí saoirse a bhaint amach. So tá sé sin ag tarlú thar na céad bhliain an duine míoch céine agus ní leannig sé raig ó bhd le chúnamh dé. But tá fearmhuiach as 8 deis chun a bheith sa libh agus chun píosa rá faoi mobaint macheangailt le Palestine agus mo chuid dílis chuig an tír san Chomá. As I was sitting down listening to the music, I was really moved by the power of it and the meaning of it, particularly in the context of why we're all here tonight. And I had written down a couple of notes in terms of what I hope to say tonight, but as usual that kind of changes, and even just watching the musicians and feeling their culture, you know, I was really moved. And one of the things that struck me was the power of tradition and the power of generation passing to generation what is of value to their culture. And we heard, you know, the likes of Joe Ban and Bill Malley and P.J. Hayes and all of these people mentioned, and their ability to pass on to receptive and interested ears, you know, their wealth, their lore, their tradition. And that is one of the more powerful things we can do as human beings. But I couldn't help think how many traditions, how many skills, how many abilities, how many memories have been denied to Palestinians because of the brutality of Israel. How many people have they killed that could pass on so much to the next generation out of pure and utter malice. The same malice that murdered people for hundreds of years here murders people in Palestine. But from what Tayyib has said and from what other Palestinians I have met have expressed, nothing will stop their identity. Nothing will stop their desire to retain their sense of nationhood, and nothing will stop their drive towards eventual independence. It's been mentioned tonight about the idea of verging into the political. I have certainly no reservations whatsoever in doing that. I also will say that there's nothing as political as being silent, because those who are silent allow those in power, those who want to occupy, those who want to corrupt, to do what they do. So every one of us is political, whether we say anything or not. The other point I wrote down just on the basis of the music was in relation to the Ball Fenian men. You need only walk across the road, those who are not from East Clare or from Fecal, and into the graveyard, where you will see the grave of Michael Slattery, who in 1866 was arrested by British forces because he was a member of those Fenians, and he was brutally treated in British jails and died in 1875 at the young age of 29. So he was a Fenian. He was one of the bold Fenian men. And if you watch the commentary at the time, he was described as a terrorist. What he did was stand up and fight for his country. And at the time he was described as a terrorist. But 150 odd years later, we are singing his song and the song of the men and women who stood by his shoulder. Oroshe the Vahawalya tells us the story of people coming home to fight for their homeland. And while we can't make our way to Palestine, our solidarity, Tayyib and Anis, our solidarity is thundering towards Palestine to support you and to stand at your shoulder and the shoulders of your people for all the days it takes until you achieve your freedom. No, I'm only getting to the notes I had made, so I do want to thank Claire, obviously, for helping organise this tonight, and my good friend Pat Hayes. I hope he's there somewhere. And I want to acknowledge Pat as one of the few councillors in Clare who has used his voice for Palestine, and it is to the shame It is to the shame of other councillors who have not opened their mouth since then. And I don't care if you're a county councillor from Kilfenora, you have a responsibility to use your voice, and so too have the senior politicians. I see Billy Keller and Timmy Dooley down there somewhere at the back. You are senior politicians. Use your voice louder than you have for Palestine, and we'll help them get their freedom. We've all watched with great sadness and despair what has been happening over the last 6 months. All of us aware, of course, that there was no point of departure for this occupation in October 2023. All of us aware that it was in 1948, this month, that El Nakba took place, when the Zionist forces took over Israel. And for 76 years now, the Palestinians have suffered under occupation. I visited Palestine in 2011, having been a strong supporter of Palestine for many years at that point. I wanted to bear witness to the occupation and to see for myself what the reality was. And being involved with Solidarity, I was able to get a sense of what life was like for the Palestinians, because many people do Holy Land tours but get no sense of what life is like for Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank. And in that time, 3 things stood out for me. And I'll just quickly recall them. One was visiting an old man called Yusuf, who was the Sidor, the grandfather of a friend of mine. And we spoke, even though he was speaking Arabic and I was speaking English, we had interpretation from his granddaughter, and we talked about his life, about his experiences, about his childhood, as I have done for many, many years here at home, in the very same way. And he talked about his childhood, which predated the foundation of the State of Israel. And he talked about his Jewish neighbours, who at that time he was friends with, who his parents were friends with, who his grandparents were friends with, who exchanged presents, who babysat for each other. And then he talked about the arrival of the Zionists and how that transformed utterly the nature of that relationship. And we have to remember that it is Zionism is the disease. It is Zionism that has created the murder in Israel. None of us, despite their accusations, are anti-Semitic. But we must remember that there are powerful, strong Jewish people, because I stood beside them in I stood beside them in Palestine during that particular trip. But Zionism transformed that relationship entirely to where they have cultivated hatred amongst the Israeli people. Excuse me. We've had the fortune in East Clare of meeting Taib, and also in Ennis with Anis. And there is a sad reality, and perhaps a striking reality, that in that relationship with those 2 young, brave, powerful men, we have met more Palestinians than most Israelis. Most Israelis have never met a Palestinian, but are told by their own government, are told by their own education system, are told by their own media narrative that these people are animals who want to kill you. And this is again the crime of colonialism, the crime of imperialism, that it manipulates the stories, it manipulates people's attitudes, and it cultivates hatred. And so now you have an intergenerational hatred built up within Israel for Palestinian people and for Arabs in general, and for anyone like us who stands in solidarity with Palestine. But there are ways of countering that. In Palestine, I also witnessed an old woman walking towards a checkpoint. Myself and a friend from Belfast walked behind her, even though we were supposed to go through on a bus. We walked slowly behind her as she made her way towards the checkpoint, which was like a cattle grid, and where she was refused entry from Bethlehem into the Jerusalem border. And she screamed and screamed and screamed. And I didn't know what she was saying, but I asked. And we were told that she was saying that my eyes are burning to see my home. She had been driven from her home in 1948 in Jerusalem and had been refused return ever since. She had the key for her return, but has been refused ever since. And that was her daily silent resistance, to go to that checkpoint, knowing she would not be let through, but just to make that silent, dignified protest. And she was an old woman that you could see walking down the street of Fecal today or in the 1940s. Yet she had more dignity than any of the soldiers that were there to stop her. The third experience of that time was meeting a young man called Ahmed, the same age as myself, when we attended a protest in a place called Bilayin, west of Ramallah. And it was a particularly violent protest whereby Israeli settlers, Israeli soldiers supposedly protecting the settlers who had taken over that area from these malicious individuals, including myself. And Ahmed got talking to me beforehand, stayed with me throughout the protest where we were fired upon, where a young Brazilian girl was very badly wounded by being shot with a rubber bullet in her face. And he stayed with me the whole time, and I don't know why, but he did. And we spoke again afterwards, and he explained to me that the settlement where we looked on had been his father's land, and his father had been murdered. Subsequent to that, we remained in contact. And he had a son, I have a son. At the start of 2023, Ahmed was murdered by the Israeli forces in the West Bank. It wasn't Hamas that created in the West Bank, yet he was murdered. And he was one of the 257 people murdered in Israel, or in the West Bank, prior to any event happening on the 7th of October. He's now, as I wrote before, the murdered father of a son, and he was the son of a murdered father. And so it is for countless families across Palestine. And can we blame his son when he grows up if he takes a gun and fights for his country? I certainly won't blame him if he does. The other point I want to make, coming towards the end, is the endurance that was already mentioned by Taib of the Palestinian people. And that is what I have seen when I met them and when I heard them. That the fact that they've been denied liberty for most of their lives, the fact that the majority of Palestinian people have never lived a day of freedom in their lives, the fact that those young men who take a fight to Israel were born into occupation should not be lost on us. The fact that in our lifetimes, it probably will be a reality that there will be not one Palestinian on earth who has ever lived a day of freedom in their lives. That is a frightening reality for us in a so-called civilized Western society. Yet they understand liberty better than we do. They may suffer apartheid, they may suffer tyranny, they may suffer occupation, they may suffer under colonialism, but they are not to colonize people. There are people in our government that are more colonized than the people of Palestine. There are people throughout Europe, like Ursula von der Leyen, who is more colonized in her mind than the people of Palestine. Because she has no freedom. If she had any freedom, why would she support a murderous, genocidal state? That's not liberty, in my mind. The Palestinians love their lives. It's always been said that they don't care about life. Why do they keep fighting? Because they don't care about lives. That's what the Israelis tell us. They love their lives, they love their families, and they love their people. But their freedom is as essential as their lives, because they understand fully the meaning of it. They will win in time. There will always be, I think, an Israel, but there will not always be a Zionism. It will perish in time and become a historic subject that we bemoan when we reflect back on it, and future historians look at the fascist, horrible nature of that ideal that developed for 100 years in the 21st and 20th centuries. The endurance I witnessed in Palestine, and I witness all the time in Palestine, is reflective of all people who have fought against occupation, including here in Ireland, including here in Fecal, where just down the road men took up arms against the British forces. And it is something that always confuses the occupiers. Why do these people fight so hard? They fight so hard because they love their land. They fight so hard because they love their country. And they love it more than the Israelis. If the Israelis loved it, they wouldn't destroy it as they do. And that is why they'll continue, they'll endure, and they'll win out. 43 years ago today, a young man called Bobby Sands died after 66 days on hunger strike. And he is a big name in Palestine because they recognize his fight and his commitment to his country in their own fight. I'll finish up by saying that Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century priest and philosopher, said, "If you can live amid injustice without anger, you are immoral as well as unjust. So I would encourage you all, embrace the anger. Anger is an emotion of utility if it's used in the right way, if it's used to sustain a campaign for the justice for the Palestinians, because it will settle down. And when it does, Israel, America, and all of its allies in the West will want us to turn our face away from Palestine and forget that it continues to be occupied. But we won't anymore. Our faces are set towards Palestine, and we will not change until they get their independence. And I would encourage you, confront the Israeli narrative everywhere you meet it. Confront it because it is a lie. Confront it because it is as baseless as fog. It can seem to confuse you, but you walk through it, it's nothing. Palestinians have a right to independence in the same way that we do. And it is up to us to continue and sustain that fight and stand by the shoulder of Tayyib, by the shoulder of Anis, and by the shoulder of every Palestinian to know that they are not on their own. And I will say finally, in using my own anger, and I say this consciously, to hell with the Zionists, to hell with Israel, Sir Shida Palestine, free Palestine, Palestine, Hurra. Come on with it.